Come join me and Father Kenneth Parsad as we lead a pilgrimage to France in April of 2027 and trace the paths of some of the greatest French saints, like St. Dominic, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bernadette, St. Joan of Arc, and more. This 11-day pilgrimage includes visits to Lisieux, Normandy, Paris, Mont Saint-Michel, Rouen, and Lourdes, where we will celebrate daily private Mass in some of the most iconic churches. Learn more at ycatholic.substack.com/pilgrimage. The greatest museum in the entire world, a museum that is far and above any other museum, in my humble opinion, is the Holocaust Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. If you were ever in Washington, D.C., and you only have time for one of the Smithsonians, make it the Holocaust Museum. It is stirring. It's not just the content of the museum or the subject matter, but also how the museum draws you into the story. You begin by taking the identity of one of the victims. It tells you where you're from, what your life is like prior to the Nazi takeover, and it challenges you to see the Holocaust not from your modern Western eyes, but from the perspective of that victim. And as you go through exhibits and learn about the rise of the Nazi regime and the prevalence of anti-Semitism, something happens. It doesn't feel like a distant story. You feel it personally. It hasn't affected a stranger. In some mystical way, it has affected you. Your soul remembers it. After exhibit after haunting exhibit, passing through mounds of empty shoes and videos of emaciated corpses, you reach the end, stirred and broken, and part of you lays in the ashes of Auschwitz. The reason why this museum is so stirring, why it moves me like no other museum, isn't just because of the content, but because of its Jewish context. It is because the creators of this museum take its Jewish understanding of remembrance and inject it into our Western framework until our hearts explode. Yet even in such power of a heart-wrenching story, there are some that are casual perusers that rush through the Holocaust Museum like a window-shopping consumer. In our overly stimulated, desensitized world, it is tempting to reduce the deeply haunting into rote and routine. It is the same with the Mass. We can so easily tune it all out and then walk away unchanged. Another weekly check in the box. We did our duty, but doing so misses the point of it all. If you want to truly walk in the mystery of the Mass, you must understand that its foundation, its context, and its curation are inherently Jewish. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. Thank you so much for joining me today as we continue our series on the Mass. Just as a brief introduction, before I became Catholic, I was a lifelong Protestant, a Baptist pastor, and a Protestant apologist. I also co-founded a ministry called Christianity is Jewish, focused on teaching the Jewish roots of the Christian faith. So today's topic is near and dear to my heart. Before I continue, though, I want to express my utmost gratitude. I am so blessed to have this apostolate and get to share my love for Jesus' church. And I am so touched by those of you who have become regular listeners, and especially those of you who have reached out to me by email or social media to express their thanks and share their journeys with me. And I am particularly touched by those of you who have supported Why Catholic financially. If you're blessed by this podcast and would like to become a patron, I would be so grateful. Your donations go a long way into making all of this possible. You can do that by going to ycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Thank you for your generosity and support. In the last episode, we began our series on the Mass, talking about reimagining the Mass. I mentioned the importance of story and how stories draw us in. A good story doesn't just compel us to read it or watch the movie, but to become a character in it. Star Wars, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings. A connoisseur of these stories doesn't just consume them. The stories envelop them. This series is all about seeing the Mass with a different perspective, of falling in love with it in a new way. It is a series that is meant to move you from a partaker to a connoisseur. And to do that, we must remember like a Jew. Like the Holocaust Museum, we are not just recollecting a moment in history, but we are entering into the story and becoming a part of it. This is core to Judaism. I mentioned this quote in the last episode. I've mentioned it in a number of episodes, and I'll mention it again. because it is the perfect quote to understand the Jewish idea of liturgy. Leon Wesseltier, longtime literary editor for the prestigious magazine The New Republic and an observant Jew, notes this about Jewish liturgy. Quote, "In the age of tradition, the past was present. It was one of the primary purposes of Jewish ritual and liturgy to abolish time, to make Jews divided by history into contemporaries and those divided by geography into neighbors. In this way, the many communities of Judaism were unified into a single people and the experiences of many Jews into a single story." End quote. In other words, Jewish liturgy is not about remembering a historical event as some sort of cognitive exercise and sentimental nod, but rather it's all about entering into the story. And as we enter into the story, we become part of it. So, for example, if you ever go to a Passover Seder, you'll note that everything is said in the first and second person. It isn't when our ancestors were slaves in Egypt, but rather when we were slaves in Egypt. It's not when God rescued them, it's when God rescued you and he rescued me. And all of the elements of the Passover Seder, like eating horseradish or parsley dipped in salt water, is meant to help us enter into the story. The horseradish reminds us of the bitterness of slavery. The parsley dipped in salt water reminds us of the whips that were used to beat the Hebrew slaves, and the salt water is the taste of tears. It is to make the reality of the story more real to us. So when Jesus says, "As often as you do this, do it in remembrance of me," he's expecting that we will remember in the Jewish sense of the word and enter into the story. He's mystically inviting us into his life. But what story specifically is he inviting us into? To understand that, we need to look at the Mass in its Jewish context, Passover. And I want to focus on 4 very specific Passover elements: leaven, or the lack thereof, the Afikoman, the cup of redemption, and the sacrifice. There are 3 Levitical feasts that often get lumped together and referred to as Passover. There's Passover proper, which is celebrated on the 14th of Nisan and ends the next day, and that is sort of a kickoff festival for another week-long festival called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Then the Sunday right after Passover, which also typically occurs during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is the Feast of First Fruits. And because these 3 feasts all get lumped together, they are often referred to as just Passover. The Levitical feasts are meant to point us to the nature of God. They are to remember an event in history. They create a shared culture, and they point to a future messianic fulfillment. According to the Levitical law, for the whole week of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Jews are not to eat anything made with yeast. The historical event that this points to is the Exodus story. The Israelites did not have time to let the bread rise, and so by eating unleavened bread, that is bread made without yeast, they are reliving that experience. Every Jewish household may do this slightly differently. In more Orthodox Jewish areas, you'll see a community bonfire where people burn their breads and cereals and any sweets made with leaven or yeast. The New Covenant always expands on the Old, and so the New Testament explains that leaven represents sin. Whereas the Jewish people were instructed to get rid of leaven once a year in preparation for the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we are told to get rid of sin in preparation for the new Passover, the Mass. St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 5 states, quote, "Don't you know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast so that you may be a new unleavened batch as you really are. For Christ our Passover lamb has been sacrificed. Therefore let us keep the festival, not with the old bread leavened with malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." End quote. And so one of the practices that developed with the Mass is confession prior to celebrating the Mass and receiving Holy Communion. We do this in 2 ways. We go to confession with a priest for mortal sins, and we begin every Mass with the Confiteor, Latin for I confess, for venial sins. Just as the Jews prepared their homes for the celebration of Passover, we prepare our hearts for the celebration of these paschal mysteries. The second element of Passover I want to focus on is the Afikoman. There's a special bag that the matzah, or unleavened bread, is placed in for Passover. It's called a unity bag, and it has 3 compartments. Early on in the Passover Seder, the person leading the Seder will take the bread out of the middle compartment, break it in half, put half of it back, wrap the other half up in a cloth or napkin, and set it aside. That piece that's wrapped up and set aside is called the Afikoman. During the Seder, a number of pieces of matzah are eaten, but the Afikoman isn't eaten until after dinner. It's after dinner that the Afikoman is unwrapped, broken into pieces, and served to the dinner guests. We know it's the Afikoman that Jesus was holding when he said, "This is my body, which is broken for you," because it says, after dinner, Jesus took the bread. Do you see the significance? The bread is taken from the middle compartment. Jesus is the second person of the Trinity, taken from the Godhead and incarnated as a human being. The bread is unleavened. Leaven represents sin. This bread, this matzah, symbolizes sinlessness. Jesus is our sinless bread of life. This bread is broken in half. Jesus' body was broken for us. The bread is wrapped and set aside. Jesus' body was wrapped in linens and buried in a tomb. And just as the bread is unwrapped and revealed, Jesus rose from the grave, revealing himself as the Messiah. Also, if you look at a piece of matzah, you'll notice that it has stripes and holes. Jesus was whipped over and over, and his hands, feet, and side were pierced during the crucifixion. No wonder Jesus chose that particular piece of bread and said, "This is my body, broken for you." Furthermore, the word Afikoman is interesting and shrouded in mystery. It first appears in the Mishnah, a collection of Jewish rabbinical traditions around 200 AD. It's a Greek word, but it's written in Hebrew letters. Many have argued that it comes from the Greek word epikomoi, which means dessert. However, in his book, He That Cometh, David Daube, a professor at Oxford University, argued that it actually comes from the word Afikomenos, which means the coming one, or he who has come. I've linked to a little explanation of this in the show notes. In Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 11, he writes, quote, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." End quote. Jesus is the Afikoman. Now let's talk about a third element, the cup of redemption. There isn't just one cup of wine served at Passover. There are actually four. Sometimes in Seders, it's just the same cup that gets refilled 4 times. Sometimes there will be 4 separate cups of wine at each seat. But each cup of wine has a specific name and corresponds to one of the I will statements in Exodus 6:6-7, which states, quote, "I am the Lord, and I will free you from the burdens of the Egyptians and deliver you from slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God." End quote. The first cup is called the Kiddush cup, or sometimes called the cup of sanctification, corresponding to the phrase, "I will free you from the burdens of the Egyptians." The second cup is called the cup of plagues, or the cup of deliverance, corresponding to the phrase, "I will deliver you from slavery to the Egyptians." The third cup is called the cup of redemption, as God promises to redeem his people with an outstretched arm. The fourth cup is called the cup of praise, corresponding to the phrase, "I will take you as my people, and I will be your God." I like to think of these 4 cups as 4 quarters in a sports game. Between the second and third cup is when you eat the meal, so think of that like halftime. So which cup is it that Jesus held up and said, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood"? We have to examine the clues. It was the cup after dinner and after eating the Afikoman, so it must be the third cup, the cup of redemption. And wouldn't that make the most sense? Jesus, after all, is our redemption. The word redemption means to buy back, and Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians 6 that we were bought with a price. At the Last Supper, Jesus was fulfilling the Passover Seder. He was expanding its meaning and significance. He was infusing a new story into the old. It no longer was just the portal into the first Exodus story where the Jewish people were brought out of Egypt through the Red Sea following the death of the firstborn. It is now the portal by which people enter the new Exodus story, where through the death of the Son of God, we are brought from slavery to sin to freedom and new life. The last element of the Passover Seder I want to focus on is sacrifice. When the Jews prepared for the frightful Passover night, they were instructed to take a male lamb that was 1 year old without spots or blemishes. They were then instructed to slaughter the lamb without breaking any of its bones. They were to smear the blood on the doorposts of their homes so that the angel of death would pass over them, and then they were told to eat the lamb. Jesus is the perfect Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. His death was the fulfillment of the Passover sacrifice. His blood was splattered on the beams of the cross, and despite the horrific abuse he suffered, not one of his bones were broken. And most Christians understand the connection between the Passover lamb and Christ's sacrifice, but often miss one very significant detail. We must also eat the lamb. In Catholicism, just as in Judaism, we distinguish between preaching, prayer, and worship. Worship in the Jewish context always meant sacrifice, which only took place at the temple with the aid of a priest. And since there is no temple, there is no sacrifice, and so Jews lament that their worship is, in a sense, incomplete. As I've said earlier, the new covenant is greater and expands on the old. And so in the new covenant, it's not an animal sacrifice that takes place at one physical location in Jerusalem, but rather it is the eternal sacrifice of God that surpasses time and space. But we must also eat the lamb. Jesus makes this very clear in John 6. Quote, "Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life within you," end quote. He doesn't say it just once. He repeats it over and over, changing the verb to eat. It's not symbolic language. In fact, even his followers leave him because they feel that the saying is too hard. And Jesus doesn't say, "Hey guys, I'm speaking in metaphors." He lets them leave. But since cannibalism is outlawed in the Bible, how do we possibly eat the flesh and drink the blood of Jesus? First, we have to enter the story. We have to enter the wardrobe into a different realm where time moves and matter acts differently. And when we do that, we recognize that we are not just eating bread and drinking wine, but rather the bread and the wine have become the lamb, not the cute little woolly lamb, but the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. We are eating the unbloodied sacrifice of Jesus Christ, and in doing so, we become contemporaries and neighbors with all of those divided by history and geography. We call this the communion of saints. It cannot be just symbolic. It must be sacramental and mystical, because that is the context of the Jewish understanding of remembrance. It's not simply a cognitive symbolic exercise. It is immersive, where we enter the story. It is not a re-sacrificing of Jesus, as some Protestants accuse us of. We are exiting our time and space and entering into an eternal moment and eating the flesh and drinking the blood of the eternal sacrifice. I want to end with one last thought. Such mysticism is difficult for us. We come to Mass with lots on our mind. We're easily distracted. We've lost the ability to imagine. And so if you ever wonder why Catholics put such an emphasis on building beautiful, ornate churches with stunning liturgy and music, this is why. It is meant to help us embrace the imaginative. It is meant to help us enter into the reality of the story. It is like the Holocaust Museum with precise lighting choices and meticulous displays. It is designed to help us let go of our world and enter into another realm, into the story. And so it is with Mass. Mass is transcendental, and so we must enter the transcendence through our imagination. Not to enter a fairy tale or make-believe story, but to enter the truest reality we've ever known. And the greater we do it, the greater that story lives within us, even after we've exited the Mass.
Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.